Hello and welcome back to the second in our 4-episode mini-series podcast, So You Want to Be Inclusive, with me, Jo McMeekan, founder and director of Send Story Group. I am here today to talk to you about the 3 ways to build accessibility into your business. So first of all, let's touch on what the differences are between inclusion and accessibility, because I think sometimes there's a little bit of inclusion confusion. There you go. There's a good phrase. There's a little bit of confusion around what the difference is between inclusion and accessibility. And we may think that they're the same, and they do intertwine. So that's understandable. Inclusion, though, fundamentally is about the culture of what you bring to the table, what you believe, and how you welcome people into a space. Inclusion is more about how you make someone feel when you are creating spaces to work with people. Accessibility is about how you do that. It's about some of the tangible changes and the tangible things that you can do within your business, whether that is on a digital platform or whether that is in an in-person space, like an event, for example. The accessibility factor is much more about what you do to create that change, to create that space. So to give you an example, digital accessibility, there are some things that I do within my business and I teach other business owners to do around digital accessibility, things that they can build into their social media platforms and their websites, for example. So including things like plain text, alt text, captions, thinking about contrasts, fonts, all of those sorts of things. That is an example of digital accessibility. In comparison, in-person accessibility, we often think of this as being a physical thing, and it is in part, but there's also a lot of other aspects of in-person accessibility as well. And there's also a real branch of connection into some of the other pillars. So in the first episode, you would have heard me talk about the 7 areas that make up the framework for the Send Story Inclusion Framework. Now, we touched on culture in the first episode, and today I'm touching on another one, which is accessibility. But I'm also going to talk to you about how that has to weave in to things like your marketing and your messaging and your systems and your processes, which are 2 of the other pillars, 2 of the other areas, in order for accessibility to be effective and for people to know essentially what you're doing. So in-person accessibility covers the physical accessibility factors. So accessibility for people who may be wheelchair users or may have some form of physical need, but it also covers sensory and well-being accessibility requirements, whether that's because of emotional needs, whether it's because of social anxiety, whether it's because of sensory overload with noise, lights, and certain spaces. All of these things constitute accessibility. We also need to consider things around digital platforms, for example. We are thinking about visual and hearing needs, but we're also thinking about neurodivergence in the online accessibility space, okay? So that's covering things like dyslexia and dyspraxia. The amount of times, and this is just a note on inclusion, the amount of times that I see people calling out bad grammar and bad spelling online in posts really grates on me, because from an inclusion and an accessibility perspective, we don't know if that person's dyslexic. We don't know if there is an additional need there that actually the calling out of that process makes them feel really shit. So there are things we can build into what we do around accessibility across that intersectional space. Accessibility wise, if we start by thinking about the marketing and messaging elements, okay? So it's all very well knowing that you've got to build accessibility into your business, and there is a legal and an ethical requirement to do so as a business owner, to make reasonable adjustment. But we often think about making reasonable adjustment or change when somebody asks for it, rather than building it in as part of our systems and our processes, as part of something that we do naturally. And that's where we need to change. So if that's you, if you're thinking, well, if I had somebody who came to me and said, oh, I'm a wheelchair user and I would like to attend your event, I would look for more wheelchair accessible venues, but I don't. But as we already know, inclusion is a silent problem. And when you are coming from a place of inclusive values and inclusive culture, you have a duty and a responsibility to be able to fulfill the other 6 areas, not just the culture, but the other 6 areas, one of which is in your marketing and your messaging and telling people about how you're accessible. The other is meeting that legal and ethical requirement. And another part of that is also putting it in as part of your systems and processes, as part of making it your norm. I will not book in to an event, I will not attend an event, and I will not book a venue unless I have vetted it with my accessibility checklists. So if you come on at the end of this week to work with me on the Inclusive Business Mark, which is my signature program, my certification program for businesses to work on those 7 areas, then you will get access to my accessibility bundle, which includes those checklists. Everybody loves these checklists because it means that you're not going to miss something. And we cover that from a digital perspective. We cover it from an online perspective. But if you're not building, whether you use those checklists or you use something else, if you're not building that into your everyday processes of, I'm booking an event, so I'm going to look at whether there is an accessible toilet space. I'm not just going to look at whether there is one. I'm going to look at what it is, how big it is, where the rails are. I'm going to look at whether there's ramps, whether there's level access. I'm going to look at whether there's a breakout space, all of these sorts of things. When you are building a new sales page, for example, you will know when you're working on accessibility for digital accessibility, you need to be thinking about the fonts, the contrast, the alt text, all of these things being put onto your web page. And you also need to be making plain text available. Now, this might be feeling really overwhelming to you at this point, but do not panic, because I can promise you that with today's digital platforms in particular, you will be doing a bulk of things around accessibility. It just might be that you're not fulfilling the marketing and messaging element of it. So you might not be shouting about what you do and how you do it. So if you are somebody who consistently puts captions on your stories on Instagram, for example, somebody who consistently captions their videos, you are already making moves towards producing accessible digital content. So that's a really important factor. If that's something you're already doing, breathe a sigh of relief. If it's something you're not, that's fine. You've got an action point to go away with. There is never any judgment here. There is never any shame over what we're doing, because you're here and you're listening. So do not feel the overwhelm when we start to talk about all of the things that you need to do with accessibility. The important thing is that we move things forward now. I have a favorite Maya Angelou quote, which is, do the best with what you know until you know better, and then do better. So whatever changes you need to make from here on in, whether they feel big or whether actually you feel like you're nailing some of this, it doesn't matter. The point is, this is all about creating your next logical step to be able to help you on your journey with inclusion and creating a more inclusive and accessible space. So when we are talking about accessibility, if there are some of the things that I've mentioned today that you're thinking, actually, I do that really well, or, oh my goodness, I don't do that, but I could do that really easily, or that's definitely something I'm going to bring in, then what I want you to do is to write it down, okay? So on my website, and I teach others to do this, as part of the Inclusive Business Mark, as part of the certification program, and we have a day where we sit together and we create an accessibility statement where we map everything out for your business and we work out what you're doing really well, what you need to change. So please know I'm on hand if you need support to be able to look at this in more depth. But as a starting point, I want you to have a think about the things that you do really well now for accessibility. And we're going to divide it into 2 sections. We're going to look at online and digital accessibility, and we're going to look at in-person accessibility. And for online and digital accessibility, I want you to have a think about all of the things that you do now that are part of your systems and processes. And it might be captions, it might be alt text, for example, that you already do that help for accessibility and inclusion. And then I want you to do the same thing for in-person events. Just list it out. It doesn't matter how small or how mundane it is, but I want you to list it out and produce a little map of the things that you do now already. And then I want you to give yourself a to-do list. And your to-do list is going to focus on the things that you are not doing just yet, but there could be some quick wins for you. So that might be, for example, if you are not including alt text, or maybe you are including alt text on your images. For those of you who don't know, alt text is a descriptor, a text descriptor. Now you can add this on to any of your social media images, to Facebook, to Instagram, to LinkedIn. You can also add it on for website functionality as well. Every single digital platform that's out there these days pretty much has alt text capability. So it's a way of adding a description to the image. And that means that when somebody is using e-reader software, they are able to understand what the image is and what the image is portraying. Now, one of the pitfalls that we often make around accessibility for alt text is that we say, for example, Jo is wearing a black t-shirt, she has long brown hair, she is smiling at the camera. Now, in the context of a social media post, often we are picking images that portray a feeling, that portray something in connection with the post itself. Sometimes we might include text over the top of that image as well. So a more accurate use of alt text would be around the description. The description, not just about what the appearance is, but about what the image is trying to convey. So this is a top tip for alt text for you. It's one of the things that I cover when we modules for digital platforms and during Inclusive in a Day when we do the Inclusive Business Mark. So top tip for you, when you write your alt text, go on to social media if you're not already doing it. And when you go to post, you will find a little box under accessibility or near the image that says alt text. And within there, I want you to have a practice. This is your second challenge for the day, to have a practice of updating your alt text. So to give you a second example, a good example, I might say, Jo is sat comfortably in her armchair. She's cozy and warm, holding a cup of coffee. She has her long brown hair down and a smile on her face. She's smiling at the camera, enjoying recording her podcast, telling the world about how they can be inclusive in their businesses. Now, there's more description, there's more imagery that we can add to that. And if you find description tricky, AI is another top tip for putting your alt text descriptions in. Use AI to create something, generate something that is descriptive and that portrays a feeling behind the image. So 2 challenges for you today. Divide what you're doing from an accessibility perspective into 2 columns. One is your digital accessibility. The other is your in-person accessibility. What are you doing really, really well? List all of those things out and then create a to-do list for yourself about the things that you're not doing so well. And your second challenge, if you're not already doing it, is to go and post something on social media today and to include an alt text image. Now, when you post this image on social media, if you put it in the alt text box, you will not be able to see it. So we often think that image descriptors need to go into the comments or into the description, and they can do, and that can be useful as well. But if somebody is using e-reader software, then their e-reader software invariably will be set up to work with social media platforms to read that alt text, so you won't see that it's there. Okay, so a couple of quick wins, a couple of top tips around accessibility, and I'm just going to sum it up now before we talk about what we're going to go on to in our next episode. We've talked about some ways to build accessibility into your business. We've talked about the digital platforms. We've talked about online and in-person events. And I've given you a social media win for alt text as well. So those are your 3 ways to build accessibility into your business. We've also talked about the importance of shouting about it. Talk about what you do. Create an accessibility statement. And I am on hand with the Inclusive Business Mark at the end of this week if you do want to jump in with more support to do your accessibility statement and your inclusion statements with me. But making it a part of your norm, your systems and your processes, the stuff that you do every day so that it becomes part of habit and you're not feeling like you're missing the boat. And if you need help or support with that, again, the accessibility checklists exist. You can buy them independently, but you will get them as part of the Inclusive Business Mark. So please know that they're there if you ever want them as a resource. They are readily available on the website. So that rounds up today. We have covered inclusive cultures and we have covered some ways to build accessibility into your business. So coming up Next, we are going to talk about your marketing and messaging in more detail in our next episode. We're going to talk about how to be an active ally, how to feel confident in what you're doing and saying, and how to put that messaging out into the world so that people know that you have an inclusive culture, because we know it's not enough just to have it, just to feel it. We've got to do something about it, and we've got to tell people about it so that it doesn't continue to be a silent problem. Thank you very much for joining me.